So, way earlier in the week, last weekend, I was thinking about some traditional salt alternatives that my people use. I was thinking about making some. It's almost time to do that. But I saw a mention a few days ago talking about kind of in a uh, preparedness situation. If you don't have access to salt, salt is a necessary nutrient, and what are you going to do about that? And there's some kind of emergency ways you can get salt if you're not close to either a salt mine or a saltwater source that is safe to use. And most people, realistically, you don't live anywhere near a salt mine, and you do not live near safe saltwater sources. That's just the reality for most of us. We don't think about it because you can buy salt, but salt is necessary. And there are some things you can do to get salt to make sure you're getting enough. There are sources, but they all have some pretty serious drawbacks. So how did indigenous people get around this? Well, my people, our homelands are in Mississippi, Alabama. So we have the Great Water, the Gulf of Mexico, as a source of salt. If you know that area as well, the Gulf Coast, inland quite a ways too, there are salt springs, and there are places even where you can mine salt rock. If you're familiar at all with East Texas, there's a ton of salt production, historic and present in East Texas. There's been some in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, just all different places. It's there. Most of these mines, of course, for industrial purposes, that's not accessible in a grid down kind of situation, though. You might get some local trade of salt, some local access, people going into these mines, but it's not a guaranteed source. Same way with indigenous people, yeah, we had salt springs and everything. If you lived around there, you could get salt, but salt springs are dependent on water output. Salinity can vary quite a bit based on whether it's been raining a lot or it's not been raining. And of course, if it's not been raining as much, you're going to have a higher salt content in the water if you have flow rate. So there's a lot of variability there. There's things that can't really be counted on. Now, a lot of people, salt licks, salt springs, they would be seen as essentially community-wide resources. People often would gather around those places at certain times of year for festivals, community meets, greets, swaps, dances, games, that kind of deal. But sometimes they were also fought over. They're not guaranteed resources. And especially if it's already a hard year, they may not, you gotta have a salt source. And you can't mess around with that. Low salt's really bad for your health. So what's the alternative that I keep hinting at? We used ashes. Now, at first thought, it's like, what do you mean you use ashes? Well, ashes, like if you have burned hardwood and you burn it all the way down to where it is nothing but a fine white powder, you've pretty much burned off all of the carbon. Essentially any organic compounds, they're pretty much gone. What you're left with is inorganic minerals. So potassium, sodium, calcium, magnesium, all these different little things that the tree bioaccumulates that plants need. They're present in those ashes. They don't typically burn off in the smoke. They remain present in those ashes. This is, of course, how you make lye for soap. And you use hardwood ashes. You put a whole bunch of it in water and you let it sit, and it basically you get potassium hydroxide, lye, through that process, and you react that with fat, and that makes soap. But that is potassium, as well as other minerals, and in small amounts, it's not dangerous. So the typical thing we would do, there's certain species of trees where their ashes specifically would be used as a seasoning. Oak, white oak, is very common, as is cedar, among some other trees. Basically, if it's a safe wood, it's usually used for the ashes. All of these ashes do have slightly different flavor profiles because these trees have slightly different mineral bioaccumulation that they do. So they do actually have slightly different effects. Some are stronger than others. There's some trees, the ashes are just never going to taste good. Other trees like white oaks, like cedar, they're usually pretty good in just about anything. Um, but again, you're using super tiny amounts. So we use salt in small amounts. You're using ashes in even smaller amounts. We're talking like the teeniest tiny little bit, like, maybe a 32nd of a teaspoon in a bowl of soup. This is an acquired taste for most people. We tend to use this as a seasoning in specific dishes. So there's one dish that in Chike is usually called pashofa. In Chahta it's usually called tanche-labona. It is essentially a dish of cracked hominy that is boiled with some kind of meat. And it's often not seasoned really heavily. You'll have seasonal flavorings added to this, but one of the typical flavorings is ashes of some sort. Oak ashes is what I have seen referenced the most when people talk about their family recipes. Their mom or their grandma would burn an oak log all the way down and save those ashes, and that is the seasoning they would use in tanche-labona. Now, our hominy, it's white pearl hominy, is the closest thing you're typically going to be able to find commercially. The ashes will actually turn it a blue color. So that's a sought after aspect of this. You don't want to put so much ashes in it that it has this horrible, acrid, bitter taste. That means you have too much lye forming. It's just a little bit of a taste. It adds a little bit of flavor, and it provides that necessary potassium, sodium, things like that. Now, the most common seasoning, though, our preferred source of ashes, we call hetok, and that comes from bean pods. They have the best flavor, and that is what, essentially you would carry some hetok around with you. People, there's a kind of generalization that indigenous cooking is very bland. Part of this is because indigenous cooking typically is one big pot that is feeding a whole lot of people. And individuals will carry their own seasoning as well as their own bowl and their own spoon. So you get food out of the big communal pot and you season it how you like. Oftentimes our food traditionally, when it is seasoned, it's not seasoned very heavily, partially because you're appealing to everybody. It tends to be traditionally low salt. Now, native people love salt. If you are around any group of native people, this is something that will come up, is that, there's kind of a stereotype amongst ourselves. We salt the heck out of everything. Part of this is because our food is traditionally cooked not very salty. So yeah, we add a lot more than what most people add to their food because it may not have been salted in the first place, as well as the fact that a lot of our very, very modern cuisine is based off of government rations, which were heavily salted, so things like salt pork, and people developed a taste for it. It's not good for you, but people have developed a taste for it. So yeah, we do tend to have this kind of thing where seasonings are all over the place. Part of it's because of traditions that materials haven't been available. Part of it's because of changing foodways due to just what we had on hand. But some of it too is people they're no longer growing their own things. So I think one of the reasons why things like an oak log or cedar ash have become as well known as they are is most people, you can find an oak tree and burn that. You can find a cedar tree and burn that. But if you're not growing your own beans, you're not going to have bean pods to make hetok, to make bean pod ash. So this is something that I do. It's pretty good stuff, I think. I personally like things that are a little more on the bitter side. So that's, I have a higher tolerance for it. Some people don't really like much of it at all. But again, if you are in a survival type situation, that bean pod ash can keep you from having sodium, potassium deficiencies. Beans sequester They bioaccumulate a lot of trace minerals. It's one of the reasons why they're so healthy for you. That's not just in the beans, the seeds themselves, it's in the pods as well. If you think about it, of course, anything related to a flower on a plant tends to be very high in trace minerals. Flowers themselves are high in trace minerals because they are necessary for the flowering of a plant. So fruits tend to be high in these trace minerals as well because they're coming out of those floral structures. So that includes the pods of things like a bean. How do you make this? Well, the easiest way is get a nice big cast iron something or other, fill it up with dried bean pods, put it on a really hot fire, and you just let it sit. Maybe occasionally poke at it, and it may flame up at some point, get hot enough, it'll burn off all the organic compounds, all the carbon and stuff. You don't want any black in it. It should just be like a very fine, very light gray or white powder. And that's your bean potash. And again, you use less of this than you do of salt because it's actually much more potent in terms of like how much potassium, sodium, etc. it contains per volume, because salt, of course, is a crystal structure. It takes up more space. It's also complex with water. Ashes are not crystalline structure. They're just, ashes. They're a lot more compact. So you do need to be mindful of that, measuring things out. Start with the teeniest amount and add little bits until you're comfortable with it. Again, it's something that goes really well in things like beans or soups or stews, especially something with corn. It really helps a lot, which, of course, if you're familiar with the process of nixtamalization, that is using a strong alkali of some sort to break down certain parts of the corn kernel to make nutrients more available. So there is actually an aspect of this where by adding ashes to the corn, you're actually helping your body digest nutrients and minerals in the corn better. So again, that white corn, we add ashes to it and it gives it a bluish color. You add too much, it's going to have a bad taste because you're essentially putting a lot of lye in your food, and it won't kill you, but it won't taste great and it might make you sick. At least in the amounts that you're going to be making, like in a pot of soup or something like that. You're not going to add that much ashes to actually make it dangerous, just to be clear. But it won't taste good. But you add enough of it, you are really and truly upping your electrolyte content, as well as helping your body break that corn down a little bit, because it's breaking down, essentially in the soup. It's helping pre-digest and make things available. So that's a bit of a rambly, circular thought on that. Definitely when I go to make some here in the next couple of weeks, I will probably actually take a video of it and record and explain the process behind it better. But today's view, I didn't really want to be walking around. Today's view, this is Nanawaya Lake. Those are the potato hills in the background. So this is real close to my people's capital at Tushkahoma. So I thought it was a nice day. It's not too windy. Real clear evening sunset kind of day. Getting real close to Deer 30 right now. This is definitely a safer place to be than in the woods at Deer 30.